Greetings, friends. It is I, Divine Serpent, although, with the amount of pantheons around, it's hard to keep track of what titles I'm anointed. Some from Yokuda call me Sep, and those of the north know me as Shore, though I believe most tend towards the name Lorcan. Today, I bring you a review of a new album from a somewhat well-known band, said band falling more into the progressive technical death metal side of things, that band being the Ritual Aura, and for today we will be taking a look at the album Velothi. Calling them a band, however, is a little bit inaccurate, as at this point in time, the Ritual Aura is more of a collaborative project, featuring musicians here from all over the place, basically, including Australia, Japan, Turkey, America, and I believe Canada as well. And that's without going into the guest lineup on this thing. So yeah, this project has been active since 2011, I believe, though initially under a different name, and has seen a few changes in lineup since, but what we have for this release in terms of musicians is Drew James Griffiths on vocals, as well as some of the orchestral work and production, Hur Ibrahim Sakman on vocals, which hopefully I did not misenunciate his name, Levi Dale does guitar, bass, piano, orchestrals, and production, and somewhat evidently is the lead songwriter. Then there is Brandon J. Iacovella on guitar and also orchestrals, Casey Brand doing percussion, and Ryan Cho on violin and viola. Plus, as mentioned, the guest list is quite extensive, though I'll get into that more later. Now, surprisingly, for such a short album, as this thing is only about half an hour total, this is in fact a concept album, and one based around some Elder Scrolls lore, and in particular, it seems to mostly follow our friend Lorcan. And naturally, with such a highly interesting concept to begin with, the music certainly rivals it. I will add a disclaimer here, the next section is a massive bit about me summing up most of the lore that the album covers, and trust me, it is a lot, so if you have no interest in the album's concept, then skip ahead to the timestamp marked in the description. So starting off and taking a closer look at that concept, as mentioned we have a primarily Lorcan-based album. Lorcan is one of the original spirits in the Elder Scrolls universe, a Netada, and is essentially responsible for the creation of the mortal plane Nirn, which may or may not have come about by tricking some of his fellow gods into giving up their powers to help shape the earth. So some of them fully gave themselves to the creation, becoming the Earthbones of Nirn, some decided not to partake at all and are known as Daedra, and some were able to see through the deception before giving themselves up completely, those now known as the Aedra, more or less. Of course, when they realized this, the Aedra got pretty pissed off, so they maimed Lorcan, ripping his body in half, where it turned into the two moons of the world, and tossing his heart far across Nirn, where it eventually landed in Morrowind, and as such in Red Mountain, some huge volcano at the very center of the island of Ardenfell, and his soul was left to wander Nirn for an eternity. Now you may be wondering why the hell this random spirit would trick the only other spirits he knows into giving up their divinity just to make some random world with a bunch of mortals, and the answer to that is something called CHIM. At a very basic explanation, CHIM is what allows one to transcend past their mortal state in the Elder Scrolls universe, as it allows them to more or less manipulate the universe itself. There is a later stage which allows one true godhood as well, but this is about as close as you get to that for now. In-game, it's basically like your ability to use cheats and save the game and all that memory. But anyways, Lorcan knew that the only feasible way to achieve CHIM is by experiencing the hardship of mortality, so he basically created the mortal plane just so that he and the others could achieve this state of CHIM. So that's the whole motivation behind this earthly realm's existence. And thanks to Lorcan shedding his immortal body, thanks to it being destroyed, it's highly likely, if not outright canon, that he did in fact achieve his goal. Fast forward a bit, and you've got the Dwemer, who are basically dwarves, and this dude named Kagranak, who is a fucking top-tier engineer, also known as the Chief Tonal Architect, finds Lorcan's heart in Red Mountain. So what he does is he decides to forge some ridiculously strong tools that can be used to harness the power of the heart, and then the Dwemer decide to use the heart to fuel a massive golem called Numidium, which would basically be a mechanical god that is theorized to be able to allow transcendence beyond the mortal plane. which in this case is very likely to be something akin to CHIM. However, the Chimer, aka the race of elves that inhabited Morrowind at the time, found out about this and attempted to put a stop to it, which basically led to a whole battle between the two races, culminating in a fight at the Heart Chamber in Red Mountain, with the Chimer forces being led by Nerevar, a great general and champion of Azura, who is one of the main Chimeri gods, and Daedra. Nerevar's forces struck down the Dwemer King, and Kagrenac kinda panicked, desperately using the tools he had forged on Lorkhan's heart, and immediately as he did, the entirety of the Dwemer race just completely vanished. Some theorize that they did in fact end up achieving CHIM, some theorize that they all just popped out of existence, which potentially means that the race as a whole just zero-summed. However, I do believe there is more strong evidence towards the theory that they all popped into oblivion and died. But either way, there's nothing canon to any of those, so no one really knows for sure. In any case, Kagrenac's tools were left behind, so Nerevar told his close general, Vorin Dagoth, to guard the tools as he went to consult with the Tribunal, the Tribunal being 3 lead counselors of the Great Houses of Morrowind. They all decided to preserve the tools in case the Dwemer end up returning, so they head back to the Heart Chamber. And that's when they find out that Dagoth suddenly won't hand them over on his own life, seeming to have gone mad. So a final battle ensues, and in this battle, the Tribunal betray Nerevar, killing him, and Vorin Dagoth disappears, presumed dead. Due to this betrayal, Azura curses the Chimer and basically turns them all into the Dunmer that you're all probably familiar with if you casually play the Elder Scrolls, also known as the Dark Elves. So the Tribunal use the tools for themselves to achieve immortality, and as such become gods for a decent while. However, Dagoth ends up returning, taking over the Heart Chamber, infecting a bunch of people with some spooky corpus plague to get them to become his mindless servants, more or less, and sending out dreams to a bunch of Dunmer to rally them to his cause. Spooky dude overall. So anyways, he once again seeks the tools of Kagrenac as he wants to use them to power Numidium, as the Dwemer once sought to do. And that's where the Nerevarine comes in, a reincarnation of Nerevar. Extremely long story short, the Nerevarine does a bunch of stuff, goes to battle Dagoth, and ends up destroying the heart of Lorkhan and killing Dagoth, which also destroys the source of the Tribunal's immortality. And thanks to that, Vivec disappears, which conveniently causes a giant meteor that he had suspended using his magic to crash into the island of Vardenfell full force, which causes the eruption of Red Mountain, essentially destroying the entirety of Vardenfell. And that's where the album ends off. So yeah, lovely note to finish on, and it took a while to explain as well. Not only that, but half of the aforementioned lore is relatively disputed on multiple accounts, though that's generally the most widely believed retelling of the events, as far as I know. And trust me, it all goes a lot deeper than that, but we do not have nearly enough time to cover it all. The lyricism on the album does tend toward a more abstract form, but if you know the storyline that you're following throughout each song, it all fits very well and effectively, and it's all pretty well written at that. And naturally, with such a ridiculously big concept, the album itself delivers quite damn effectively on the musical aspects. First, though, let's take a bit of a closer look at the musicianship on this record. Because considering the guest musicians on this thing, as well as the band themselves, there is quite a bit of it. Starting off with the guitars, Levi and Brandon do a pretty stunning job. As far as technical skill goes, it is definitely here in bounds, as evidenced by the amazing solos and occasionally very technical lead melodies. There are also some spicier riffs on here that are quite an intricate time. Another thing that I did notice is that a lot of the playing on here is surprisingly emotive, which definitely helps with the atmosphere of the album. So yeah, lots to be said for the guitar there. And the guest guitarists that play on here certainly don't slack either. Nick Padovani of Equipoise plays a solo on one of my favorite tracks here, on a Sijic Chime, and it is not only extremely impressive, but it sounds amazing on the track, standing out yet at the same time not feeling remotely out of place. The fretless guitar solo on Dreamer's End, performed by Tom Fountainhead Geldschlager, which I hopefully didn't mispronounce, mostly known for his work in Obscura, is even more interesting. Fretless guitar definitely not being that common of an occurrence in death metal after all. The more unique, floaty sound to it is definitely quite an interesting addition, and despite that, it blends very well with the rest of the track as well. As for the bass on this album, it is mostly handled by Levi, and it is handled very well at that. Though it is slightly less of a focus than the guitar on here for obvious reasons, there is still an abundance of very unique and fun bass lines on here, and a decent few that are very impressive at that. I did, however, say mostly handled by Levi, as there is one track here where the bass is entirely covered by Zach K, that track again being CHIM. And the bass on that track in particular is quite impressive as well, with some very fun lines throughout the entirety of the song that definitely add nice flair to it. Getting into the vocals next, there is a lot of variety in that department on this album, and I cannot say that there are any moments on here vocally that I dislike in the slightest. Starting off with the two main vocalists, Drew James Griffiths and Ibrahim Sakman, both are fantastic vocalists, both in the harsh and clean department on here. And while it is a bit more difficult to tell them apart without directly knowing which vocal lines each of them perform, her does noticeably have a deeper, more impactful and guttural tone as far as the harsh vocals go on here, whereas Drew's vocals feel a bit more on the aggressive side of things, having almost a slightly more dissonant spin to them, interestingly enough, and overall being a little bit more varied as well. As far as clean vocals go, again, they're very interesting on this album, almost always being either layered or run through a really cool vocoder effect type of deal, or both. As far as guest vocals go, the first ones of those we get is with CHIM from Adriana Tentori, who does some clean vocals on here, and my god, are they great. Her performance on here is amazing, and her more strong yet haunting tone fits extremely well with the track. Then we have a pair of guest vocalists on Dreamer's End, Colin Butler and Zach K, and as difficult as it is to make out distinctions between harsh vocalists, I at least recognize Colin's vocals on the track here, since they're very Necrophagist-esque in nature and quite stand out at that. Moving on to the percussion on here, it is pretty damn spicy as well. Tons of very technically impressive moments from lots of the bass patterns, getting quite impressive to a decent amount of unique and interesting fills throughout the album as a whole. Certainly, at the very least, on par with what you'd expect out of some top-tier technical death metal drumming. And now that we're past all of the standard stuff, we can get into some of the more unique instruments on this thing. Starting off, we've got piano, a bit more tame, but still not the most common thing in death metal of all genres, and again, Levi does quite an amiable job throughout this thing, with some lovely melodic portions, and most importantly invoking some great atmosphere. The most standout piano track on here, however, is the intro, Destati the Womb Astral, and it is performed by Jimmy Pitts, who does keyboard for a ton of other great bands, most notably Eternity's End and Equipoise. But yeah, his performance on piano here is highly impressive, a very haunting and beautiful piece which showcases both great phrasing and all-around talent, as well as some very emotive and atmospheric playing. Then we've got Ryan Cho, who performs both the violin and viola on this album, of which there is quite a bit, and deservedly so, as both instruments are performed masterfully on here and add quite a bit to the sound. Very cool inclusion overall, and a very welcomed one, considering how much both instruments are implemented. We also get to see a bit of use of harp on Dreamer's End, performed by guest musician Sarah Choi, again doing quite a wonderful job and adding some nice variety and atmosphere to the song. We get to see some cool use of flute by James Sewell on In My Own Parting Words, which is a purely instrumental track, a very calming and atmospheric piece at that, with quite a bit of emotion to it, and the same can be said for the flute performance on said track. And lastly, we have Nate Miller, who actually does erhu on CHIM, interestingly enough, which is more of a traditional Chinese folk instrument, and it definitely sounds pretty damn cool on this track as well. It is pretty interesting to note that a lot of the less standard instrumentals on here, particularly the more orchestral ones, do have a more Eastern tinge to them overall, mostly since Morrowind itself does take a decent bit of influence from Eastern cultures. So yeah, cool little correlation there. In any case, the virtuosity and musicianship on this album is just practically overflowing, as you can clearly see here, and it is all not only very impressive, but put to quite amazing use thanks to the songwriting here. And considering all the spurging I just did about the musicianship, I am sure it is no surprise to anyone that I absolutely love pretty much every facet of the songwriting on this thing. As far as song structures go, this album is very non-standard, starting off all of the tracks do tend towards the shorter side of things, the longest song on here being only a bit over 5 minutes, but a lot of the songs basically flow directly into each other, the only real exception to this being there is a small noticeable break between the first and second half of the album when we transition from Sunder to Keening. And despite the short lengths of the tracks on here, there still manages to be very little repetition, aside from where it is gladly welcomed, such as with some of the very, very catchy choruses that you'll find on a few of these things. But yeah, the songs tend to follow whatever structure they deem necessary, and all flow very, very well together. As far as the melodies on this album go, there are an absolute ton, and there are a decent few riffs on here too, even though, as mentioned, there isn't all that much in the way of repetition. But in any case, the melodies are about as varied as the song structures on here, if not more, swapping back and forth from instrument to instrument to get a very different feel from each one, some leaning much more towards the more atmospheric, some being more aggressive and energetic, some being very melodic and beautiful, some being even a little on the more dissonant side to add some spice in here and there, although this isn't employed as often. And naturally, the melodic facets draw from tons of different styles outside of death metal, lots being more jazzy or more along the lines of what you'd expect out of some folk music or classical, orchestral, etc. It goes on. And that's another thing I should mention, there is a huge amount of variety in the sonic styles of this album, basically covering everything that I just mentioned and more. You'll feel a very small amount of black metal and doom metal on here in certain spots. Again, the orchestral and folk influences are here in spades, as with the more progressive influence, the jazzier side of things. A few more groove-based sections peppered throughout too. There is a ton of variety here, and it all flows and blends so extremely naturally that you wouldn't even question it. So yeah, amazing songwriting in general, tons of super high-quality melodies and riffs. I'll also say the juxtaposition between all the varied vocal parts on here is quite a nice time. The different styles of harshes are pretty fitting to whatever atmosphere they're on at the time, and again, woo, those guest vocalists blow me away. The rhythm sections on here kill it too. Some really great percussion throughout this thing with tons of awesome and interesting drum fills, as well as some great driving rhythms, all with tons of general variety, quite a few being rather catchy too. Bass lines fall basically into the same category, also having some great variety and being highly interesting and quite catchy at certain points. I'd again like to draw attention to the folk and orchestral sections, since both of them do take a more Eastern influence as far as I can tell, something that not only sounds amazing with the rest of the music, but matches perfectly thematically speaking as well. On top of that, they do tend to have some amazingly catchy melodies, and even more so tend to do wonders for the atmosphere on this thing, making some of the tracks feel just so absolutely massive and emotional. And even when the orchestration takes more of a back seat, the atmosphere on here is still pristine thanks to the wonderfully written instrumentals. The atmospheres on this album are just in general extremely well done and quite all-consuming in their nature, and again they do a great job at translating the emotion and mood that each of the tracks has conceptually. If you're at all into the lore of this album, the atmospheres will likely surprise you in how well they match with the concepts being covered, at least as far as I am concerned. Production on this album is also pretty good overall. It's a little bit on the clean, more stripped down side, as you'd expect with most modern technical death metal, and whilst I definitely think the tone for a lot of the more traditionally death metal based instruments could have been a bit more dense on this thing, I get that this might impede with the clarity and all, though I do personally feel that it'd be a risk worth taking for the sake of the sound. But at the same time, this isn't really much of an issue, considering the amount of orchestration layering this thing tends to take care of that density issue pretty well on its own most of the time. Not to mention the percussion on here is pretty spacey overall, which definitely helps, and even if the guitars are cleaner than I'd prefer, they definitely still retain a nice edge to them, which is more than enough to translate very well into the atmosphere at the least. So yeah, I can't complain too much about the production overall. And thus, we get to the track-by-track section of the review. And if you're also not a fan of that, then feel free to skip ahead, but I'm going to try keeping it brief for the sake of time, since I'm sure I've already covered my thoughts on this album quite well already. But yeah, here we go. So, the opener, Destati, The Womb Astral, is a lovely little introduction track with an amazing piano bit. Again, shout out to Jimmy Pitts for such a fucking excellent performance here. But yeah, super beautiful track, which sets an amazing atmosphere before we get into Sunder 1, Lorcan, Heir of the Void, which fucking immediately just blazes to life in a fury of percussion and riffs, quickly bleeding into what is probably one of the most intense tracks on the album. It comes across super fucking well after such a calming yet slightly haunting tone from the last track. The semi-clean vocals on here that scream are super fucking catchy, the melodies are complex and interesting, and the riffs are heavy, and the track bleeds into a really cool and ominous recitation of the Ashland hymns before suddenly fading off. Evidently, this song didn't even think to try overstaying its welcome, considering how short it is. We then get a nice slow bleed into Sunder 2, Elysian Flesh Divinity, with a beautiful, more acoustic, very atmospheric section, which interestingly enough leads into some surprisingly fitting harsh vocals. Again, the harsh vocals on here seem to very interestingly fit the atmosphere of the almost entirely acoustic and orchestral section quite well. And then we bleed into some heavier moments here and there, which gives us some very nice melodies and intensity, whilst retaining the overall atmosphere of the track. Some nice folk and orchestral use on here, again very atmospheric song overall with a pretty hauntingly beautiful feel, and some very nice juxtaposition. Sunder 3, a reasonable amount of selfishness, fades into a much faster pace than the previous track, still retaining some nice atmosphere, though heavier at this portion, and bringing some really good riffs. This track definitely has riffs in spades, and has quite a few other interesting bits. Some of the most memorable piano and violin lines on here, especially for a more intensive track, and it has an amazing bass portion as well. Plus the song gets very jazzy later in, which matches itself surprisingly well to the atmosphere and is honestly just a really fun time. This then leads into Sunder 4, The Weight of Falsehood, which again starts off more slow and atmospheric to somewhat juxtapose the last track, though the initial atmosphere does seem very uneasy and kind of unstable, and for good reason, as it gives way pretty quickly to the rest of the track, with some slightly heavier riffing and melodies, as well as some quality harsh vocals. I definitely think that the great combination between the atmosphere and the melodies is the main draw of this one, especially as it is a very tense feeling track, as it feels like there is a lot of back and forth between the softer and heavier parts, and it gives off a bit of a floaty vibe overall, if that makes sense. It's a really interesting piece and does a perfect job of raising the tension to probably the highest point on the album, which is perfect for the track directly after it to completely dissolve. The next track, Keening 1, CHIM, is a fucking titan of a song and is easily my favorite off of this album. Bleeding in with easily the most haunting and chilling atmosphere so far, this thing ramps quickly up into a fairly intense verse-like section with great riffs, amazing leads, some top-tier harsh vocals, and again that thick atmosphere just coats everything. Gives a bit of a breather before crashing directly into the chorus, which is easily the best moment on the album in my opinion, as this chorus is just so overwhelmingly powerful. Extremely swathed in amazing atmosphere, riffs, melodies, and a fucking overwhelming sensation of just being so generally massive. It definitely feels like the climax of the album as far as I am concerned. We go through the rest of the track matching this intensity as the chorus ends, burning through some top-tier riffing and some really cool solo sections. Even when this thing drops to the more orchestral and folkier bits, it never loses out on any of that overwhelming intensity. And when it hits the chorus for the second time and the vocals from Adriana come in, it is absolutely stunning. It bleeds out perfectly after ending on a high note with both the harsh and clean vocals holding one lyric, and I'm just going to sample the whole last chorus portion for you all here real quick because, my god, it is good. So yeah, best track right there. Then we get Keening 2, In My Own Parting Words, which is a much needed break. It's a very calming atmospheric piece which doesn't focus on any intensity aside from just working with the sheer beauty of the melodies within it. It is an extremely soothing and very necessary change of pace from the last song, lasting just long enough to bleed straight into Keening 3, Dreamer's End, which is another extremely high intensity track, just completely going straight into it after a small little refrain in the intro. But yeah, this thing is non-stop in its intensity, bringing some amazing riffs, some quality melodies, which definitely hold a high air of aggression. It's a very fast-paced track and definitely one of the heavier ones on the album. It's got some nice variety here, mostly in the melodic portions, definitely helped by the less standard folk instrumentation on here, as well as that cool fretless guitar solo. So yeah, very fun and very intense track. Also, I love how fucking catchy this one line is. As well as the super catchy outro portion. Maybe I just really like people singing about the fall of 6th House, though. Who knows? Then we get into another very climactic point in the album, though not as intense as CHIM. The last track here, Keening 4, Red Year and the Fall, is definitely one of the most atmospheric pieces on this album, and at that is quite intense as well, though there is a kind of sense of parting and acceptance throughout it to temper that intensity, which is really cool and interesting. Particularly with how melodic and surprisingly serene the chorus on this thing is in relation to the verses being as intense and riffy as they are. Though there are definitely some more melodic moments throughout here aside from the choruses, and on top of that they do a wonderful job of keeping the atmosphere to a more sorrowful state, I guess you could say. Some great juxtaposition on this track in that regard too, since this track easily has some of the heaviest riffing on here, yet despite that, the atmosphere and melodic nature of the track still tend to be heavily prominent. Also, it starts off with one of the coolest quotes from Vivek, so that's always a good time, especially since the Vivek quote in question is actually quite comical in its relevance to the concept of the track, if you think about it. I see what you did on this one, Levi. In any case, it's a very good finish and a good representation of the Red Year too, so that's always pretty fun. And lastly, we get the bonus track on here, a cover of Silt Sunrise. Pretty much purely acoustic and orchestral, this track is stupidly good, and that may just be Morrowind nostalgia speaking, but I feel like they elevated the atmosphere of the track to a whole new level, and having it played on such a variety of instruments makes it feel not only more varied, but also more personal in a way, which is just so extremely emotionally evocative to me. I absolutely love the choice for this thing to be the last track on here, even if it is just a bonus track at that. It truly feels like such a natural ending to the whole album, despite not even being written for the album, which gives even more credit to the amazing thematic songwriting that the Ritual Aura pull on this album. Hell, there are possibly even some other parts on this thing that are lifted from or inspired by the in-game music of Morrowind that I simply didn't correlate, but I would not at all be surprised if there were, since the music just matches the concepts so well. I'm also going to say, if you're a fan of delving super deep into the lore context of each song, normally that's something I do here, but thankfully I can point you to an even better direction for it, since currently on the Ritual Aura's Facebook page, there are a bunch of lore posts regarding each individual track of the album in chronological order, and those are still coming out as we speak, so I definitely recommend going and taking a look at those. Very entertaining reads, even for those who are already pretty much know what each track is about, thanks to the track titles and the lyrics and all that. And that about wraps up my thoughts on this album, I would say. Amazing musicianship, really cool concept overall, high quality songwriting, and absolutely not a single dull moment throughout any of the songs. Atmosphere in particular is very fucking potent on this thing. My issues with this album are all very minor, more or less. I wouldn't call every track a 10, obviously, but at the same time, I'd kind of struggle to find anything lower than a 9 on here. An 8 maybe being the absolute lowest I can see a track on here being rated, And yeah, again, the production isn't perfect to me, but it's certainly not bad either. All in all, though there are some very minor tweaks that could push this thing even higher, I would rate this album a 10. For such a short release, this thing takes you on such a fucking massive journey, and thanks to how interestingly varied and progressive it is, that journey only gets more and more interesting the more listens you give it. Velothi is definitely one of my top releases this year, easily my favorite release out of death metal too, and easily one of my favorite albums in general for a while to come as far as I can tell. I cannot recommend this thing enough. And yeah, that's basically everything. If you liked the video, I would love if you subscribed for similar future content, though I will warn this channel does tend more towards power metal. I would also appreciate it if you left me a like, or if you disliked the video then tap dislike as well, and leave some comments down below if you have any thoughts on the video, the album itself, the band, or anything that you'd want to discuss, more or less, since I am always both very open to discussion and am generally a big fan of it. And as always, I've been Empyrean Serpent, and thank you for watching.